take a look at some of the early style explorations that the designers were looking at, you can see the look they were going for. It's very clean, very modern, with some elements of depth and 3D to help the user and hint them as to how they can interact with the application. If you look at the widgets, so these are the default building blocks you have to put together your application. Again, we see this very kind of clean style, very simple. A text box isn't even a box. It's just a line with some bounding edges. Your user interface isn't what your users are there for. They're not there to see your beautiful text box. They're there to kind of perform a task. So the controls should just kind of get out of the way, just melt away and let them perform this task. And this is very much the feel. This is from the light theme. Hopefully a lot of you have seen the Holographic Ui. It comes in two major flavors. There's theme.holo, which is a dark theme, or theme.holo.light, which is a light theme. So these are two starting points with which you can put your apps together depending on the look and feel you're going for. So here's another example from the Compose email application. On the left we have the gingerbread application where you can see there's a number of boxes, a number of different shades of grey, quite a lot of things on the screen. Compare it to the honeycomb example there. You see it's been simplified. It's all about performing a task. All the UI crutches get out of the way and you just focus on what you're doing. So this is the look and feel that Android has adopted, and I'd encourage you to think about how you can make your applications fit in with this look and feel. Now that Ice Cream Sandwich has been launched, finally, we've refined that look and feel further. This is one of my favourite quotes from Matthias, who's the head of UX at Android. He says, "We've taken what Honeycomb has done and pumped up the snooty design quotient and toned down the geeky nerd quotient," which I think is a great quote. Basically, we like the direction that Honeycomb is going in, but I think they perhaps watched a little bit too much Tron, it was perhaps a little less user-friendly. Ice Cream Sandwich has taken the great work and just polished it off a little bit, course-corrected slightly. So it's the same direction, but it's made a lot more friendly to the users. So look at the first-party apps, look at what the platform's doing, and think about how you can make your application fit in with that style. You want your users, when they first run your app, to feel right at home, to kind of intuitively know how to use it. By following the patterns that the platform is pushing, your app will be able to do that. So, I want to take you through a few patterns and how they work well for tablets, and how now with the Ice Cream Sandwich release and a few tips and tricks for backwards compatibility, how you can use these patterns on a range of devices. So, first off, I hope you understand what I mean by a UI pattern. It's much like a software pattern you might be used to, like a worker pattern or something like that. So it's a generalized solution to a recurring problem. The benefits of this are that they're going to be familiar to your users. Your users are going to kind of come into the application and just kind of instantly know, like, feel familiar, feel at home, know how to use it. Not only that, but it'll get easier for you to write. A lot of these patterns have gained some framework support, so they're quick for you to implement them within your application. That said, a lot of these patterns are very much guidelines rather than restrictions. So some applications might have a very strong look and feel. If you're writing a 3D shooting game, for example, these might not apply to you. But if they say 90% of the applications out there, you will benefit from following these patterns. So I'm going to take you through a number of discrete patterns, what they are, and some tips on implementing them. So the first one is the action bar. Hopefully this is familiar to a lot of you. We've been talking about this for a little while now. So the action bar is this big horizontal bar at the top of the screen, here shown on a phone and on a tablet. Like I said, we started talking about this last year when we worked with Twitter on their phone application. And this is dedicated real estate where people know to look to perform actions within your application. Taking a look at this from the tablet, it's kind of organized into 3 general sections. On the left, you have a kind of app icon, giving a sense of place, next to which is an organization or kind of navigation section. And then on the right-hand side, you have a series of actions which are available within your application. Looking at those 3 sections in detail, so on the left, you by default will have your application icon. So this is a pattern we're borrowing from the web, really. So many a web page has the masthead right up there, and users know that hitting that button, hitting that logo is going to take them right back to their home activity. It's kind of like an escape hatch, like, oh, I want to go back to the room. So by default, in your application, we've introduced this paradigm to let the users get back to the root of your app. That said, if that doesn't make sense, you can overload this metaphor and use up navigation. So here we've added a little arrow you see next to the icon of Gmail, which lets you take you one step up. So as developers, it's within your control to customize this navigation experience. I'll talk more on this later. And lastly, if you have a very branded application, you don't have to just show your application icon, the little square icon. You can provide any drawable. So YouTube, for example, which provides a much more branded experience, instead of showing its default icon, shows a bigger logo. So the next section is the view details or navigation section. So there's a number of common navigation methods which we've moved up into the action bar. So it's now the one consistent place people look to switch tabs, so the tabs have moved up there. We also offer a list-based navigation. So here, gallery example in the middle, you can select from a list and jump to different sections within your application. That said, you can provide any kind of bespoke method of navigation. So maps, for example, here. Maps considers searching to be the primary way which users navigate around information within their application. So it places search on the left-hand side. Compare that to the top example, calendar, where search is an action, whereas the tabs are the primary navigation. That's why search will appear on the different sides. And the final section on the right is the actions, giving the pattern its name. So this is what the users can do. This is the one place they're going to look, what can I do in this application? It's kind of, we're taking the analogy of the options menu that you used to have, and made it kind of more front and centre. We believe this on-screen control, rather than using an options menu, it has a number of benefits. With the options menu on the phones, you kind of didn't really know whether there were any options under it. You kind of just had to hit it and see, and some people like miss certain functionality. Using an on-screen affordance, like the action bar with the overflow section, you immediately know that there's options available. You can see them on screen. If there aren't any options, it just wouldn't be there. So we feel that's a much, much better user experience. With the actions, there's obviously only so much room that you can put items up there. So some are shown front and center on the action bar, and the rest are overflowed. So that last icon you'll see up on the right-hand side, you're heading back into your next disclosure window, and you can see further options. One thing to bear in mind with this kind of actions is people tend to scan it left to right. So if you have a clear primary action that you want to use to perform on the screen, put it on the far left. So if you have like an email compose window, for example, the clear action, the call to action is to send that email. So you have that as the leftmost option, so it's the first thing they see and it's easy to find. The action bar is relevant to the current application on screen, but it's not for contextual. If you're dealing with selections within your application, the action bar actually has a different mode it runs in called the Contextual Action Bar. So here's an example from Gmail, where I've selected a number of messages in my inbox. The action bar actually rotates and kind of gives you this alternative means for dealing with selections. So like the normal action bar, it's broken into 3 sections. The leftmost is there for kind of dismissal, and next to which is some state information. So here it shows you how many emails I have selected, but you can have like a select all or select none. Some of them means for dealing with the selection. And then finally on the right hand side, you have the actions which you can then perform upon the selected items. So this is the kind of primary way you want to deal with selection. We've kind of deprecated using kind of long press and popping up a contextual menu. This is the way we deal with selection now. And you'll see it throughout the platform in Honeycomb and Ice Cream Sandwich. If you want to implement this kind of contextual action bar, you need to look at the action mode class, which will deal with displaying it and acting upon the user's selection. Some classes in the platform will help you to build this kind of interaction. So if you're working with list views, for example, you can use list views set selection mode to multiple modal, which will automatically show the contextual action bar, and you just implement a callback to populate the actions and react to the selection. So, if you want to implement the action bar within your application, if you're running on Honeycomb and above, API level 11 and above, basically, if you set a theme of Hollow, the Hollow theme I talked about before, you'll get one for free. And Hollow is the default if you don't set one on your target API level. But if you're running on an older platform, pre-Honeycomb, and you want to have an action bar, there's a number of options. So basically, the simplest way to do this is to create your own. To basically create a view which looks just like an action bar. And this is what we've done in the Google I/O application, and you can see some source examples of that later on. There's a number of great community libraries out there, so if you take a look at things like Action Bar Sherlock or GreenDroid, these will help you to create action bars on APIs pre-Honeycomb. So you don't have to wait for your user base to upgrade. These are immediately available to you now. And one new option you have is using the Action Bar Compat library. So this is some sample code which we just launched with the Ice Cream Sandwich SDK. So if you've downloaded ICS, it's right there on your computer already. And this basically lets you write to the Honeycomb API. It'll create an action bar on older releases. So there's no need to wait around for users to upgrade. I skipped over a bit there. I'm saying just because it's a kind of standard way of navigating doesn't mean that every action bar has to look alike. So there's a number of ways you can customize it for your particular application's context. So if you look at the action bar class, you can do things like making it semi-opaque or hiding it away when it doesn't make sense and then bringing it back later. Or if you follow the link there, it'll take you to a blog article where we describe how you can customize the look and feel of it. So you can change the colors and the drawables and make it fit in with your application's branding. So, as I hinted at before, Ice Cream Sandwiches arrived now, so the action bars had to learn a few new tricks in order to work on a range of devices. Basically, what we've said is if you write to the action bar API that we introduced in Honeycomb, the system will take care of how to display that on smaller devices. Obviously, there's going to be contexts where there's less room, so a phone obviously has a lot less horizontal real estate than a tablet. So if you want to display the same information, you're going to have to make your information more flexible. So one way of doing this is by specifying the show as action rules to say if room with text. And what that's saying to the system is I want this to be shown as an action, but if there isn't room, I'm okay with it being overflowed. And if you provide an icon, it gives the system a chance to compress it down to just a smaller representation rather than having to have the text as well. Also, if you work with the default navigation methods, like the drop-downs and the tabs I talked about, the system's going to know how to present those on a different device because it knows about them. If you're providing a completely customized form of navigation, the system might not know how to display that in a different context. So consider using the built-in ones. So here's an example of how an action bar might get moved from a tablet to a phone. And here we see on a tablet it's all on one row, whereas on a phone there just isn't enough real estate to do that. So instead, what we've got here is an example of what we call stacked navigation. So here's the stacked action bar. Basically, if there isn't enough room on the device, the action bar will go into multiple rows. So here the tabs have been forced onto the second row. The interesting thing to note is this is kind of completely reacting to like how much space there is at runtime. So in this application, in Portrait, there just isn't enough room for everything in one line, so it stacks it. Whereas if you just simply rotate the device and there's a greater amount of horizontal real estate, they get put into a single line again. So you don't have to write any code to manage this for you. This is just writing to the API and the system handles it for you. The other new mode that the action bar has learned is called split navigation. So sometimes you want to have kind of your navigation controls on screen, and as well as a number of actions, and there just isn't enough room to do that all at the top of the screen. So here, we've added a new mode which you have to opt into, called split action bar when narrow. You can opt into this either at the application level or per activity. What it does is it moves the action items down to the bottom. So on the left-hand side here, we have an example without the split, and then turning on, you see the icons move down to the bottom. This is great for applications such as Gmail, which wants to have a number of actions on screen and immediately available to the user. So you want you to have quick access to be able to mark as read or archive your emails. So it keeps its navigation at the top, splits the action bar, and puts those actions at the bottom so they're immediately available. That's it, the action bars. So the next pattern I wanted to talk about is multi-pane layouts. So with the kind of different size of devices available on the market now, it just doesn't make sense to have a single screen which kind of just gets stretched up and down. Essentially, it just doesn't look very good to have excessively large runs of text. It's really bad for the eye to scan and have to move your head around. It makes for a very bad kind of reading experience. So what we're advocating is actually breaking down your UI into sort of kind of individual chunks and arranging those upon the screen. This is great because it allows you to show different things on screen at once, but also allows you to retain greater degrees of context. So on a phone, where you kind of end up burying down and stepping down for each level, you select an option, go to a new screen, you kind of immediately lose what you were last looking for, where you came from. With these multi-pane layouts, it allows you to keep more things on screen, retaining greater context so the user knows exactly where they came from and what's going on. And another thing to note about these multi-pane layouts is people tend to scan them left to right, so you want to be going from least to most detail in that direction. Else you get this uncanny valley feeling where you feel slightly lost. So to create these layouts, we introduced in Honeycomb the fragment class. So this changes kind of the basic unit of a screen in Android down from the activity level down to these reusable fragments of the screen. We think fragments are so fundamentally important to Android that we broke them out from the platform and made them available in a standalone support library. So hopefully a lot of you have seen the support library already, which lets you use fragments all the way back to 1.6. So I would go as far as saying if you're not writing fragments now in your Android activities, then you can make more work for yourself in the future. So I highly recommend you take a look at this. The sports library is great, so if you haven't checked it out, I encourage you. It's more than just fragments in there. There's things like Viewpagers and Cursor loaders, and lots of great stuff in there, so check it out. So for these multi-pane layouts, there's a few things to consider. So quite a lot of applications have this kind of master-detail relationship. So on a phone, you might end up writing two fragments, each of which is displayed full screen on an activity. So here you have like a master A and a detail B. On a tablet with its greater real estate, you can put those both on the screen at the same time. So obviously you're going to have to think about how you then communicate between these two fragments. Essentially a fragment always exists within an activity. So a lot of these communication methods are basically going to use the parent activity to message pass between them. Another thing I would note here is some people try and build the phone screen as one single activity which just swaps out the fragment. So if you select something in the master pane, it swaps out the master for the detail pane. And I would encourage you to avoid that and actually create a single activity for each one. The reason being, if you try and do that swapping, you end up writing a lot of code to manage state, to manage the backstack, to get the animations looking just right so it feels like they're swapping screens. You end up writing more code, which means more to test, more code to introduce bugs, so it kind of ends up being a bigger headache. So I would advise writing individual activities. So a few strategies you can use for getting these fragments to talk to each other. First one here is one we talk about a lot on the developer documentation, is to have a kind of callback interface. So essentially that when you have an interaction on the kind of master fragment, it directly calls a method on the parent, which then talks to the other fragment and passes the message that way by the parent, which is cool. But there are a few other options. First one being you can call set target fragment on an individual fragment. So what that does, it tells the fragment to return all its communications back to another fragment. So you can return activity results, for example, straight to another fragment rather than having to go by the parent. Another one which I very much like is using intent to pass messages between them. We're Android developers, we're all very familiar with intent, and we love how it lets us write very modular code. So using intent, you can actually, when they initiate something on one fragment, just start an intent by calling start activity, and have the parent activity kind of capture that intent, and then pass it to another fragment. So if you're calling start activity, obviously you're going to have to make the activity hosting it kind of capture that rather than spawning a new activity. So you're going to have to use the single task or single top intent flag, and then the new intent will get routed to the activities on new intent method, where you then react. The reason I like this very much is because it means that the fragment itself doesn't have to know anything about its parent activity. Using the callback interface, the fragment has to is tightly coupled to its parent. It has to know that it implements a certain interface in order you can communicate. Using the kind of intent communication method, I like it very much because you can write this kind of decoupled code, which lets you put these fragments in different contexts all over the place without worrying too much about the parent. You just speak intent, and they just talk to each other like that, which is cool. The other thing that fragments and multi-pane layouts let you do is let you handle orientation very differently. So a lot of these devices, especially these widescreen 10-inch tablets, are very different beasts when they're in landscape and portrait. So using fragments, you can easily create layouts which react to these different orientation changes and provide an optimized view just for the way they're being held at the moment. So if we take the example of these multi-pane master detail relationships, there's a number of strategies you can follow. So by default, if you don't really provide much of an orientation-specific layout, you might get something like the first example up here, where they just get stretched. This may work for your content, but quite often doesn't. So you end up with kind of like too narrow, too wide, whatever. So instead of that, I'd advise you to look at some of the other patterns you can use. So the next one, stacking, lets you kind of just reorder the elements on the screen for a better flow in different orientations. So take the calendar app, for example. It shows in its main pane kind of a calendar view, and then on the right of it, in landscape, it has kind of a month overview and your appointments for the day. If you were to rotate that and keep the same layout, they'd end up kind of too squashed and too narrow next to each other. It just would look pretty bad. But if you use fragments to kind of create these like reusable chunks of interface, you very simply just create a new portrait layout, which just basically lays them out vertically rather than horizontally, and you get a much better view, kind of with the camera on top and the things underneath. The next pattern you can use is the expand and collapse pattern. So this is just recognizing that sometimes when you go into portrait, there just isn't enough room to display these two things on screen at once. So the expand and collapse pattern actually collapses down one of the columns to a smaller representation. This works really well if the column has a really strong way of representing its content in a kind of reduced size. So the example here is we use this Google Talk. So in the left-hand pane, you have your listing of chat buddies with their picture and their text. When you go into portrait mode, and there just isn't as much horizontal real estate, it collapses it down to just their pictures. So this works really well for conserving space. The next pattern is the show hide. So this is again when you recognise there just isn't enough real estate when you're in portrait, so it kind of hides away one of the panes. So Gmail, for example, has a list of messages and then kind of message details you're reading it. When you rotate it, it actually hides away the message list, and you just kind of like read the message. The important thing to think about when you provide these optimized layouts, especially the stack and the show hide, is to preserve functional parity. You don't want to have your users feel like they're lost just because they rotated their tablet or something. So basically you need to give them an easy way to recover, an easy way to get the functionality back. So the show hide example, like Google Talk, gives you a little arrow, you hit that and it expands them right back out. So they're never lost, they can easily get back the functionality that was hidden. Gmail, for example, uses that up navigation I talked about earlier on the application icon on the top left. Hitting that brings the message list right back there, so they're not lost. Okay. So that was the kind of multi-pane kind of layouts. The next pattern I want to talk about is changes in app navigation. So basically, in Honeycomb and beyond, we've added lots of new routes into your content. So with the new rich notifications, the very interactive kind of widgets like this YouTube Stack View widget, and the recent apps which actually jump back and forth, basically people can deep link into your content. You can no longer expect users to come in through the front door, as it were, like through your application's launcher icon. They're going to arrive at your app from a number of different places. And because of that, they're going to want to be able to navigate differently. So Android has traditionally relied on temporal memory. Where did I come from? A breadcrumb trail. Whereas users also have a very strong structural memory. Like I know I'm within the Gmail application and I want to go somewhere else, but I can't remember the route I got here. I just know I need to be somewhere higher up in the navigation hierarchy. So to tap into this, we've kept the back button, which lets you go back through this temporal stack, but we've introduced this application up behavior to tap into the structural memory. This lets you kind of navigate through your application's view hierarchy. So as an example of how these are different, take the contacts application. So if we were to select a single contact, in this case, both up and back do the same thing. They take me back to the contacts view. Whereas if from the contact details I hit an email address, it takes me off to compose an email. In this case, hitting back should take me back to where I came from. Whereas using the up button in the top left, I'm now within Gmail, takes me to the root of Gmail. Similarly from that Stack View widget I showed you in the YouTube video, so I click on an individual video, it takes me to that video's page in the YouTube app. Hitting back takes me back to the desktop where I came from, whereas up takes me up to the root of the YouTube app. So I encourage you to think about how people are going to arrive at content in your application and where they're going to want to navigate to from there, and make it easy for them to do that. Okay. So the next part I'm going to talk about is going beyond the list. So a lot of phone applications use a list as kind of one of their default navigation patterns. And this works well on a small form factor. But it just kind of doesn't look very good on larger form factors such as tablets. And it's also missing a trick. If you're running on a device which has a gorgeous high-definition screen and a fast GPU, you have the ability to kind of really engage a user and show a different representation of your content. So think about ways you can produce a more kind of explorative, kind of like fun experience, like akin to flicking through a magazine. So we're taking a look at some of the platforms examples of this. So here we have some examples in the top left. This is the Carousel View, much like using it in the music application. So you fling through a carousel of album covers. Compare that to just a list of covers, and you have this very fun, explorative way. So people using these kind of larger screen devices are looking for different ways of kind of interacting. In the bottom right is one of my favourite, I think we've already talked about today, is the YouTube application, which presents this kind of 3D video wall, this carousel that you spin it around. And it's a very kind of fun, engaging, immersive way to interact with content. So think about how you might show a different representation of your content that kind of leads to these kind of different use cases. To help you build these views, we've open sourced a bit of code. So the Carousel View here is like the music album covers. So if you just drop this code into your application, implement a few callbacks, you can very easily build this very kind of engaging, immersive way of interacting. It's also a great example of render script. If any of you wanted to get started with writing render script, which is a very portable way of writing high-performance graphics and compute operations, it's a good example of getting started with that. The other tool we've added to the support library is the Viewpager, which lets you build paging horizontal views. So like the market application here, with these big feature graphics at the top, which auto-align, lets you build these kind of very visual, graphical elements into your application. I'd really encourage you to kind of think about your content and think about how it should have a different representation on different devices. I think we're moving beyond the kind of, this is my phone app, this is my tablet app, into the kind of responsive mobile application, which can basically display itself in different ways depending on how much screen real estate you have left. So basically you might write an application which when it's running on a small device does use something like list view navigation, whereas when it has more real estate available to it, it kind of changes its context and changes its mode of operation and just optimizes for the display, perhaps being more graphical, more engaging. So it's going to be on the list. And the last one I want to add is thinking about gestures. So Ice Cream Sandwich has really tightened up the gestural language used in the system. So if we take these two screens here, we have the Recent app for multitasking and the browser tab switching app. You can see they kind of look very similar, the representation, basically switching between tasks and the ability to dismiss them. So each of these apps, you just slide them horizontally and the view kind of slides out and fades as you go. The same thing happens with your notifications on Ice Cream Sandwich. So your notifications sit in your notification tray and you slide them out and they fade away. So basically the platform is trying to present a consistent way of doing the same operation throughout the system. So think about where these might be useful in your applications, where the user is going to kind of know how to use your application, know how to do a dismissal gesture, and it'll feel like it just fits in and it's a first-class citizen on the page. So those are a few patterns I wanted to highlight to you guys. I'm now going to take you through a few do's and don'ts of how to build them. So one thing we always advocate is do aim for a single APK. So like I said, you want to be designing for this whole spectrum of devices, different sizes and so on. But one thing I would always say is like aim for a single code base, because this will make maintaining your code, maintaining updates to market much, much easier. To help you do that, check out that compatibility library I said, which breaks out things like fragments and so on, so you can use them already straight away in your apps. Use the resources framework to help you to customize your app to kind of react to the size of devices on. So a lot of people know about kind of like drawables, MDPI, drawables, HDPI to provide optimized assets, but you can use the resources framework to provide a lot more for you to do a lot of the heavy lifting. So one of my favorite tricks is using the dimensions file. So under your values folder, you can put a dimensions file which holds things like text sizes or tap target sizes, things like that. What you can do then is then using the resources system, like here, using values-large to provide an overloaded version when you're on a different device. So here you can set a larger text size or a larger tap target size depending on the device it's running on. It avoids having to write lots of switches in your code, it's just very clean. Definitely always look to provide optimized layouts for both landscape and portrait. Gone are the days where portrait was the default orientation. Who's use a tablet and launch a market application and have that kind of activity rotate as a first one? It's very jarring, kind of breaks the user experience very much. So definitely think about not only supporting different orientations, but providing these optimized layouts for different ones. Always use the styles to basically reduce redundancy. Backtrack all your styles, so it makes it very easy to update your application. Say you want to change your text size. If it's in your styles, you'll just change it in one place and it ripples out throughout your application. And again, think about basing your application on one of the default themes like Holo and customizing from there. So here's an example of like providing assets for tabs. If you're running on an older device, you might want to provide some tab assets which look right at home with, say, like a gingerbread that deal here. So we've got some different stateless drawables there for phone devices. But tabs on a tablet look very different. Holographic thing looks quite different. So here, if you can use the resources qualifiers like large MGPI V11, that will provide you a different set of assets which will be picked up by tablet devices running Honeycomb and beyond. So you're kind of fitting in with a base platform, but you're still customizing it to kind of marry it with your own branding and visual style. The other thing to bear in mind is OEM customization. So do try and test on devices with OEM customizations. One great introduction which I love in Ice Cream Sandwich is if you look in the styles XML file, you'll see this comment. Basically, we said from now on, OEMs cannot customize the theme.holo. If they want to customize, they can use the device default theme. But we're guaranteeing that every device from Ice Cream Sandwich onwards, the theme.holo will look exactly the same. So if you don't have the time or resources to test on a bunch of different OEM customized devices, then you can use this theme.holo and it will look exactly the same on each of those different devices. Also consider turning on hardware acceleration. A lot of these devices coming out got huge screens, very high pixel density. The Galaxy Nexus, for example, 1280 by 720, there's a lot of pixels to pump around, especially if you're trying to get 30 frames per second, 60 frames per second in animation. So look at turning on hardware acceleration to enable you to hit those frame rates. The reason it's not on by default is there's a few APIs on Canvas which we couldn't hardware accelerate. So if we were to turn it on by default, we would feel clear breaking your applications. So we advise you to test it first on a hardware accelerated device, and then enable it on your market version. So if you don't hardcode the assumption that API level 11 and above is a tablet, so Ice Cream Sandwich is here, API level 14. If you've hardcoded this assumption, then it's broken. I've seen a number of apps on my Galaxy Nexus which basically assume that if you're on API level over 11, it's a tablet, and so I get these kind of tablet layouts which don't really work on a smaller device, so don't hardcode that. Also don't assume X large as a tablet. So we're seeing some kind of tablet-style devices running large screens, like a ViewSonic has a 7-inch device running Honeycomb. In fact, I advise you to look at the new shorter script qualifiers rather than the size buckets, which will give you much more granular control of the cutover point in the layout. Don't use small fonts. They're pretty bad on a tablet, so use these dimension styles, for example, to factor out your sizes so you can provide optimized versions of different devices. And also watch out for using the fill pairing.